Welcome to Becoming Home. I'm Classie Watson, trauma-informed practitioner, former mental health therapist, and founder of the Intentional Design Method and CW Intentional Life and Business Design. This podcast explores what it means to design a life your nervous system can truly rest in. And in the last episode, we talked about a simple but very important truth. You cannot build a meaningful life from a body that feels unsafe. And when people hear that, the next question is usually something like this: how do I actually know if my nervous system has been living in survival? Because survival mode doesn't always look the way people expect it to. It's not always dramatic. It doesn't always look chaotic. And it definitely doesn't always look like someone falling apart. More often, it looks like competence. It looks like being dependable, being insightful, being the one who can figure things out very quickly and easily, being the one who keeps moving, keeps producing, keeps caring, keeps solving, and keeps showing up. Now, that's the part that makes this so difficult to recognize, because many of the qualities people are praised for are the very same qualities that often develop in environments where someone learned very early on that they needed to stay alert, stay useful, stay capable, or stay ahead in order to feel some measure of safety. So today, I want to look more closely at that. Not just survival mode in a clinical sense, not nervous system language in theory, but how survival mode actually disguises itself in real life, in the way people relate to time, the way they relate to rest, to relationships, to responsibility, to leadership, to self-awareness, and even to healing. Because one of the most confusing things about survival patterns is this: they often produce people who look very high functioning on the outside, and yet underneath that competence, there's still a body living as if everything depends on staying braced. So let's dive into the episode. One of the reasons survival patterns are so hard to recognize is because they often don't produce people who appear broken. They often produce people who appear incredibly capable. And that matters, because when a pattern causes obvious dysfunction, people tend to pay attention to it more quickly. But see, when a pattern produces reliability, productivity, insight, discipline, responsibility, people rarely stop to question it. In fact, they often build identity around it. They start to see it as evidence of strength, and other people start to reinforce that. They say things like, "You're so strong. You always handle everything. You're the reliable one. You're the one who always gets things done. You're the one people can actually count on." And see, after hearing that enough, a person can become deeply attached to the role that survival helped them build. And it's not because that role is inherently bad, but because it often becomes difficult to separate genuine character from nervous system adaptation. And that is where the confusion begins. Because now the question is no longer just, what am I doing? The question then becomes, what part of this is truly me? And what part of this was built in response to living braced? That is a deeper question. Because some people have spent so many years being rewarded for their adaptations that they no longer experience them as adaptations. In fact, they experience them as personality, as maturity, as excellence, as leadership, or as proof that they're doing life well. And see, sometimes what they call discipline is actually tension. What they call leadership is actually control. And what they call discernment is actually distrust. Also, sometimes what they call resilience is actually overfunctioning. And none of that means the person is false or fake. It simply means they may have built an identity around patterns that once helped them survive, but now they're quietly preventing them from actually resting. And one of the first things I tend to notice in people who are living in bracing is the way they relate to urgency. Everything feels important, everything feels time sensitive, everything feels like it needs attention now. And because everything feels urgent, nothing is actually prioritized in a grounded way. That's one of the clearest patterns. People think they're prioritizing, but often what they're actually doing is reacting. They're moving toward whatever is loudest, whatever feels most pressing in the moment, whatever creates the most internal pressure. And when someone lives that way long enough, they start to build an entire way of relating to life around urgency. Their schedule feels urgent. Their family responsibilities feel urgent. Their business feels urgent. Their relationships feel urgent. Even their healing begins to feel urgent. And what often develops underneath all of that is a distorted relationship with time. There's never enough of it. I'm always behind. I don't have space. I can't slow down right now. I'll deal with that later. But later never really comes. Because when urgency becomes a way of life, the nervous system stops expecting spaciousness, slowness, rhythm. It starts assuming pressure. So the body becomes habituated to speed. And once someone becomes habituated to speed, slowness no longer feels neutral. It starts to feel unsafe. That is one of the most important things people tend to miss. They think their problem is poor time management, and sometimes it's not primarily time management. Sometimes it's a nervous system that has learned to organize life around pressure, around momentum, and reactivity. And because that way of living still produces output, it often gets mistaken for effectiveness. But see, output and groundedness are not the same thing. Motion and alignment are not the same thing. Getting things done and living wisely are not the same thing. A person can complete many things from a place of urgency and still be completely disconnected from whether they are moving in the right order, for the right reasons, or even at the right pace. And see, over time, that creates a life that feels full, but not well held, busy, but not deeply intentional, accomplished, but internally chaotic. Now, another pattern I see often is that many people don't actually know what rest is. They know how to collapse, they know how to distract themselves, how to numb, they know how to reduce output for a few hours. We're talking about energetic output, but they don't necessarily know how to enter restorative rest. And there's a difference. A lot of people think rest means laying down, watching television, scrolling, eating something, zoning out, having a glass of wine, doing something that feels like a break from productivity. But the body can still be activated through all of that. The mind can still be racing, the nervous system can still be stimulated, the person can still be emotionally loaded, mentally overactive, physically tense. So now they quote unquote rested, but they don't actually feel restored. And then what happens is they start assuming the issue is that they're just bad at resting, or they start telling themselves they're simply not the kind of person who can slow down. But often that's not actually true. Often what's true is that real rest feels unfamiliar. And what feels unfamiliar often gets interpreted as inaccessible, not because it's actually inaccessible, but because the nervous system has not practiced it. That is such an important distinction. Some people think they are incapable of quieting their mind, but many times they have simply not built the internal conditions that allow quiet to feel safe enough to enter. And that takes practice, it takes patience. It takes learning to tolerate the discomfort of not filling every space with thought, sound, stimulation, productivity, or emotional noise. And see, for many people living in survival mode, that first encounter with actual rest can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Because when the body starts to slow down, things that were easy to outrun and avoid while busy begin to rise to the surface. Feelings, fatigue, grief, awareness, needs, loneliness, anger, maybe disappointment, the truth of how they actually feel. So, in that sense, many people are not avoiding rest because they dislike peace. They're avoiding rest because peace creates room for truth, and truth requires reckoning. One of the most important things I've noticed in high functioning people is how often they skip over themselves. They notice what they feel, but they don't stay with it. They notice exhaustion, but they override it. They notice disappointment, but they move on, sometimes quickly. They notice resentment, but they suppress it. And they notice the body saying no, but they continue anyway. And after enough years of doing that, it becomes automatic. They don't even realize how frequently they bypass themselves. This is part of why so many high functioning people don't immediately recognize that they're actually living in survival mode. Because recognizing it would require slowing down long enough to actually register themselves, their needs, their limits, their signals, their inconsistencies, their body, their deeper emotions. And see, that is not what they've been trained to do. They've often been trained to produce, to adapt, to help, to keep going, to solve, to hold, to be productive. So when something in them says, this is too much, they have often built a life that teaches them to answer that by saying yes, but keep going. Notice they acknowledge it, but they keep going. And the more a person practices that response, the more foreign it becomes to truly honor themselves. That's why people can be very self aware and still miss themselves quite frequently, because awareness is not the same thing as attunement, and insight is not the same thing as care. A person can know a lot about themselves intellectually and still have a very underdeveloped relationship with their own needs. That is one of the more subtle and most overlooked forms of dysregulation. Not dramatic chaos, not obvious collapse, but chronic self abandonment in polished form. And here's where this becomes even more nuanced. Because, see, I'm not saying these individuals never honor themselves. In fact, many of them do. They set some boundaries, they say no in certain situations, they've learned how to identify unhealthy dynamics. Yes, and they've gone to therapy or are probably still in therapy. They've even developed language for their experiences. So internally, there can be this sense of, I've addressed this, or I'm aware of this, or I know how to handle this now. And in some areas, that's true. But what often goes unnoticed is that the self they are honoring is not always the full self. Because when someone has been conditioned to skip over themselves for long periods of time, they don't just skip their needs, they often skip their deeper emotional experiences. They skip the parts that require stillness, the parts that require slowness, the parts that require sitting with discomfort long enough for something more honest to surface. So, what happens is they address what's visible, They set boundaries around what's obvious. They correct what's more easy to identify, but they may still bypass the deeper layer, the emotional residue, the internal patterns, the ways they are still overriding themselves in a quieter, more subtle way. And because they have insight, because they've taken some action, because they've implemented some changes, there can be an illusion of completion, an illusion of, I've handled that. When in reality, parts of it have been addressed, but the root pattern is still organizing behavior beneath the surface. This is something we see often in trauma-informed work. A person can develop cognitive awareness before their nervous system has fully reorganized, which means they can understand themselves differently before they actually experience themselves differently. And that gap matters because the nervous system doesn't reorganize through insight alone. See, the nervous system reorganizes through repetition, through rhythm, safety, through slowed awareness, through learning how to stay present with internal experience without immediately overriding it. So when someone is used to skipping themselves, they don't just miss their needs, they can also miss the places where they are still operating from the same internal pattern, just in a more refined or socially acceptable way. And that's what makes it so easy to overlook. Now, another place survival mode reveals itself very clearly is in relationships. And I want to slow down here because this part is a lot more nuanced. See, sometimes people start noticing the same kinds of relational dynamics repeating in their lives, the same kinds of friendships, the same kinds of romantic relationships, the same kinds of people depending on them, draining them, misunderstanding them, disappointing them, or pulling them into familiar roles. And often I'll hear them say things like this: why do I always attract these kind of people? Why do these people always find me? Or why do I keep ending up in this dynamic? And sometimes there is truth in that question. People are often drawn toward what reflects something aspirational, stabilizing, helpful, or desirable to them, right? So, yes, someone may be drawn to your steadiness, your thoughtfulness, your insight, your competence, your light. But attraction alone is only part of the story. Access is another. Because people may find you, but you are the one who lets them stay. And that is where the deeper pattern begins to show itself. Many people at this stage have already done some level of healing work. Maybe they've gone to therapy, maybe they've learned more language, they can identify their patterns or triggers, they've set boundaries in certain areas. So there is often a genuine sense of, I'm not who I used to be. And again, in many ways, that's true. But the deeper question becomes, are you as far removed from your previous patterns as you think you are? See, because patterns in relationships don't continue by accident or happenstance. They continue through alignment, not just conscious alignment, but emotional, behavioral, and nervous system alignment, more subconscious alignment. And this is where the illusion can become very subtle. A person may recognize unhealthy dynamics faster. They may set some boundaries. They may even address certain behaviors more directly in relationships. So, from their perspective, they are no longer operating in the same role. But when you slow down and you look more closely, you may still see participation in the same pattern cycles, just in a more refined way. For example, a person may no longer tolerate overt disrespect, but they may still overfunction emotionally in the relationship. Maybe they may no longer say yes to everything, but they still feel internally responsible for managing the other person's experience. They may speak about boundaries, but still engage in subtle behaviors like over explaining, over giving, rescuing, or staying longer than they truly desire. Another example, they may have stopped certain behaviors altogether, but not fully examined the underlying beliefs driving those behaviors. Beliefs about what it means to be helpful, being needed, being supportive, being the one who understands, the one who can handle it. And those beliefs matter because even when behavior changes on the surface, if the underlying belief systems remain intact, the pattern often reorganizes itself in a new form. This is something we see clearly in both psychology and relational dynamics. Behavioral shifts without deeper integration often result in pattern evolution, not pattern resolution. And because these individuals are insightful, because they've done work, because they can articulate what's happening, there's often a tendency to overestimate how much has actually changed. And it's not intentional, but because awareness creates a sense of distance, and that sense of distance can feel like transformation, when in reality, some of the same dynamics are still active, just less obvious. And this is where the perspective embodiment gap shows up very clearly. The person sees themselves one way, but their choices, their patterns, their relational dynamics are still revealing where deeper alignment has not yet occurred. And see, because they don't slow down long enough to fully observe themselves inside the relationship, they miss it. They miss the subtle participation, they miss the emotional positioning, they miss the ways they're still available for the same pattern, even while believing they've outgrown it. So the question is no longer, why do I attract this? No. The deeper question then becomes, where am I still aligning with this? Even if it's in more subtle, more refined ways. Another thing that makes survival mode difficult to recognize is that people can become very good at intellectualizing themselves. They understand the language, they understand the patterns, they understand the trauma, attachment, boundaries, nervous system regulation, self worth, emotional intelligence. They can explain it all. And because they can explain it, they often assume they are further along in embodiment than they really are. This is one of the clearest forms of the perspective embodiment gap. The person isn't lying, they are genuinely insightful. They do understand a lot. But see, understanding is not the same thing as integration. And this becomes especially visible when a person has strong insight, but still keeps repeating dynamics that contradict what they say they now know. They speak about boundaries, but still overextend. They speak about healing, but still choose relationships that keep them in old roles. They speak about peace, but still build lives organized around speed, pressure, noise, and emotional congestion. And because they are so articulate, the people that are around them often mistake their insight for actual change. And sometimes they mistake it for change too. But see, a person can be incredibly self aware and still very under practice in actual embodiment. That is why this work requires humility. Because many thoughtful people can describe their problems beautifully while still living inside it. These same patterns show up in leadership all the time as well. And often, business culture rewards them. Being busy all the time, being highly visible, being seen everywhere, knowing everyone, taking every opportunity, being in every room, having your hands in everything, being the one who carries the most, the one who holds it all together. A lot of that gets praised in the business world. It gets framed as dedication, ambition, and leadership. But see, when you look at it through a trauma informed lens, many of those patterns are rooted in hyper responsibility, control, and nervous system activation. And here's where it deepens. A leader who is bracing is not just busy, they are often operating from a deep internal belief that if I don't hold this together, it will fall apart. And that belief shapes everything. It shapes how they delegate, how they hire, how they trust, how they make decisions, how they relate to their team. And because they are capable, because they are insightful, because they figured out things in many areas, they often trust their own judgment deeply, but sometimes too deeply, to the point where they do not even recognize where they are out of their depth. And this is where humility becomes essential once again. Because insight is not the same as skill, confidence is not the same as competence, and competence is not the same as capacity. A leader can be very intelligent, very perceptive, very capable in certain areas, and still lack the structure, the systems, or experience required to lead effectively in other areas. But see, if their identity has been built around being the one who knows, being the one who figures things out, being the one who does not need help, then acknowledging that gap becomes increasingly more threatening. So instead of slowing down and building what's missing, they keep moving. They keep hiring without a clear process. They keep managing without structure. They keep expecting results without creating the conditions that produce them. And then there's another pattern that often shows up, talking a lot about change without fully implementing it. You have the meetings, the conversations, visioning, re strategizing, regrouping, reframing, naming the same issues over and over and over again. But the most important structural changes still don't happen. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, because for many leaders, that loop feels productive enough to protect them from confronting the deeper issue, which is often not a lack of ideas, it's a lack of grounded implementation. Sometimes because slowing down enough to build proper systems feels a little too risky. Sometimes because asking for help threatens their identity. And sometimes because they're more attached to appearing competent than to admitting what they don't actually know how to do. And that is another form of bracing. You see it when leaders keep hiring the wrong people, but never examining their own process. You see it when they keep telling themselves, the market is the problem, people are the problem, nobody wants to work, nobody is competent, nobody can do it right. And sometimes those external issues are very real. And sometimes those narratives are also protecting the leader from having to confront their own blind spots, their lack of processes, their lack of systems and policy, their lack of training structure and procedure, their lack of clarity, their lack of maturity in particular areas. And because they are so used to being self reliant and insightful, they keep moving as if confidence alone is enough. But insight is not the same as skill, and leadership requires much more than self belief. And this is where trauma informed leadership becomes different, because it requires a level of self honesty that's not performative. It requires the humility to say, I am capable, and there are still areas where I need to grow. I have insight, and There are still things I do not know how to do yet. I've built a lot, and there are still structures missing. That level of humility is what allows leadership to mature, because without it, competence becomes a ceiling instead of a foundation. So, what usually makes people finally realize they've been living this way? So, in my experience, it's rarely just exhaustion by itself, because many people have been tired for years. They've normalized that at this point. They call it adulthood, ambition, responsibility, leadership, or just life. And that is what makes all of this so difficult to confront, because for a long time it's worked. People build their lives this way, they build careers this way, they build their businesses this way, they maintain relationships this way. So there's no immediate reason to actually question it, right? Because it's so normal, it's so ingrained until something interrupts it. So, what usually wakes people up is when the cost becomes visible in a way they can no longer ignore. So, perhaps it's a health issue that arises, a panic response, burnout that becomes much more physical, a relationship ending, or a marriage that's falling apart, or a body that simply will not keep absorbing the same pace. That is often when the illusion breaks, because now survival no longer feels productive. In fact, it starts to feel more expensive. And many people only begin to confront the depth of their bracing when the body, the relationship, or life itself starts saying, you cannot keep doing this in the same way. So, as you sit with this episode, I don't want you to turn it into some diagnostic checklist. What I want you to do is slow down and notice what you recognized. What in this episode felt familiar to you, not just intellectually, not just what made sense, but what you recognize in the way you actually live. And I also want you to notice what you felt. What in the conversation showed up in your body? Was there tension? Was there discomfort? Was there a moment where something in you paused, where something felt familiar? Even if you couldn't quite fully explain why or name it, because sometimes awareness doesn't just register cognitively first, sometimes it registers in the body first. And that matters. So I want you to notice both. And I want you to ask yourself, what did I recognize in my thinking patterns? And where did you feel it in your body? Look at your life and see, where are you still moving through life in urgency? Where are you still skipping over yourself? Where have you mistaken insight for embodiment or competence for actual safety? Because often the beginning of change is not a dramatic decision. It is the quiet moment where something in you becomes honest enough to say, this is not just who I am. There is more here. This is a pattern, and patterns can be changed, and I'm ready to see it. Thank you for being here for this conversation. If something in this episode resonated with you, take a moment to sit with what surfaced. And if this is a conversation you feel someone else might need, share the episode with them. You can find more episodes of Becoming Home on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, take care of yourself and continue becoming home.